Hi, I'm Ven and welcome to my book corner. Today we're taking a look at Hunger. This is the follow-up to Gone by Michael Grant. We will deviate slightly as normal. We'll do a quick catch-up on what happened in Gone, and then we'll jump into this book specifically in terms of story, characters and world building, as well as any positives and negatives from this book. So let's just jump straight into the recap. Gone begins when anyone over the age of 15 sort of appears to bump out of existence, and it leaves everyone under 15 in a certain area of San Francisco. There's almost like a force field around the area preventing people getting in or going out, and this encompasses Perdido Beach, sort of the seafront. There's also a nuclear power station and Coates Academy, which is kind of an academy for gifted kids, for want of a better word. And you end up with a conflict between the people at Coates Academy and the people that live in Perdido Beach. As it turns out, there's two sort of respective senior people, for want of a better word, in this, being Kane and being Sam, end up in charge of their respective areas. There's a massive fight, and basically Perdido Beach win out, and Coates Academy kids are forced back to Coates Academy. There's also a number of other sort of plot lines going on here. So you've got some stuff going on around who should be in charge of Perdido Beach. You've got a bit of power play between Drake and Kane as well up at Coates Academy. You also have some strange alien monster thing underneath the ground in a cave, which is never really explained, although we get some explanation of that in this book. And you also have what caused all this, which is all tied to a character called Pete and the nuclear power station in the town. So this book ends there, and it sort of fast forwards 3 months, I think it is, to the beginning of Hunger. So let's just jump into that story now. So the story begins with Sam and a group of people going out to some of the fields because they've realised that there's not enough food and they need to start farming. They've been to numerous fields already, and as you'd expect, because the crops haven't been maintained, a lot of those crops have died and withered and rotted. But they get to one specific field, and that field is full of cabbages. And it's weird because there's no birds, there's no vermin, everything seems okay. So they walk in, and a character called Ez, who is literally introduced in this chapter and dies in this chapter, goes into the field and gets eaten by monster mutating worms. So that kind of establishes a bit of threat. And what you have is a period where they're trying to figure out how they can safely get into the field, get the food, and get it back to town. And this book is called Hunger for a reason, because the major driving force of all the characters is the fact that they are starving to death. I'll touch a little bit more on that in world building when I get there. Meanwhile, up at Coates Academy, Kane has been in a virtual coma for the last 3 months, and when he finally comes round, he has a plan to go and basically take over the power plant and redirect the power, or so it appears, so it goes to Coates and away from Perdido Beach, to give them a bit more of a strong footing. The third aspect of this is Lana, who has kind of secluded herself away so she doesn't get harassed into fixing every bump and niggle that people have, and she is hearing voices in her head from the monster under the ground, and she kind of hatches a plan to try and kill it. Big crux of this story, however, is Perdido Beach and around Sam, and the fact that he is in charge, he doesn't want to be, he's only 15, and every little problem is brought to him. Nobody else is stepping up really and taking any form of authority away or helping him with his choices. Everyone's just pushing it all onto him, and he is slowly but surely crumbling and making bad choices and blaming himself for not knowing things or not acting quick enough. And then you have multiple other sort of mini plot lines going on in Perdido Beach as well, where people accidentally die as one person develops their powers and as an act of self-defense protects themselves, and this sort of stokes a bit of a anti-powers feeling, for want of a better word, which by the end of the book is rife with a sort of splintering of the groups. You have the idea of, well, all the food's gone because they didn't ration it fast enough. You've got Albert, who was the kid who opened up the McDonald's and helped feed everyone, who's trying to find some way to get people to work as well. He's trying to basically reinvent capitalism by getting money or creating a barter system. And the thought of them going out and fishing and things like this, just to try and, get some form of organisation there. Eventually, Kane moves against the power station. Big fight. It turns out that Kane's actual thoughts of what he was doing weren't really his own, because he wants the uranium rods for the monster in the dark, who is also hungry and wants food. So, the story here is pretty solid. The idea of the splintering of one society and mind control of one of the things is a lot cleaner than in the previous book. And it's solid. It's pretty basic, and you can kind of count the numbers as it goes, but it's a solid foundation for the book. In terms of characters, and much like the first book, this is kind of overstuffed, although not to the same extent. However, this book does introduce a number of new characters, in some cases just to kill them off. So I'm just going to list the new characters. Antoine, Brittany, Duck, Ez, Francis, Hank, Harry, Hunter, Josh, Lisa, Lance, Mickey, Mike, Orsi, Steve, Turk, and Zill. Now, of all those characters, Hunter is largely used as a plot device. He's the one who develops powers accidentally and accidentally kills someone. Duck is also a plot device in many regards as well, but for different reasons. I'll touch on that a bit later on. The only one out of all of these that really have a massive impact on this book in particular is probably Zill. Zill ends up sort of in charge of the anti-powers group by the end of the book, and that sort of doesn't bode well for the follow-up book to this. The problem I have with this book, and it's not too dissimilar to my issue with Gone, is that whilst there is personality at a surface level to all these characters, with the exception of Sam and Kane, there is hardly any character development. And even for those two characters, Kane doesn't really have a huge amount. He eventually realises what's going on with the voices in his head, but you don't get any resolution to that, per se. Sam has a bit more of a character arc in that he ends up rejecting the leadership because he just can't cope. He's a 15-year-old being expected to act like a parent. But the weakest part of this is its characters, especially with Kane and Drake and Astrid and Sam, because you've got whiter than white and darker than dark, and there's no depth there whatsoever, which is a shame. You don't really get such one-dimensional characters in stuff like this, and this is, I believe, the longest book in the Fayz series, and it's disappointing to not get a little bit more in there from these characters, if I'm honest. However, in terms of world building, that is where this book is in many ways at its best. So it does make good use of the full runtime to sort of take a look at Perdido Beach in particular, as it begins to splinter under the weight of its own inadequacy in many ways. You get different groups beginning to form, you get an anti-powers idea forming, and almost a vigilante approach to things. You get the person who is probably genuinely trying to help, but it doesn't look good for them because it looks like they're trying to hoard things for themselves. You've got Sam in charge, who really doesn't want to be, and probably shouldn't be. He's probably not the person who should be running this. And you get the sort of general feeling that all the power concentrated in one place is a bad thing because he's just not equipped to deal with it, and no one else is really stepping up to the plate to help him. And you also get the focus on food, and it's established that, well, the first thing all the kids did was eat all the cookies and ice cream, which you'd expect, and as they gorged on all the biscuits and all the stuff that has a reasonably long shelf life, really, the meat and the fish and the fresh food was just left to rot. And so now, 3 months in, all the stuff that they could have had if they'd rationed sooner and been more sensible about it, which they were never going to because they were kids, is gone. And they're now genuinely facing starvation. And it's how do we deal with this? So you have a couple of points where they're trying to get people to go to the fields, but how do you get 9-year-olds to go and pick cabbages in a field? How do you actually get people to do this? They still want to be fed, but they're 9-year-old kids. And it's how do you motivate people for this? And by the end of the book, there's sort of some semblance of order here, but you have a direct splintering within the Perdido Beach area of there's a very anti-powers feeling led by Zill, and it's not looking good for them for the next book. It's a very bleak sort of outlook overall in this because there's not really, it doesn't feel like there's any light at the end of the tunnel. But the strongest point of this is its world building. It also explains a little bit more about the Fayz, which is the monster under the ground, and it touches on that and where that came from, and actually it looks like there was something else going on before the Fayz appeared. So that's pretty good too. So, I need to preface this with I think this is a better book than Gone. I think the pacing is better. I think the world building is better. I still think it does have a few issues though. The first issue, and this is one just of personal taste, is that this is a very grim book and there is no positive end in sight, and that can make it quite a difficult read because there isn't really any hope or optimism in here. Even by the end, things are getting worse, not better. Whether that carries on in the future books, we'll have to wait and see. The other thing that I don't like is some of the use of the characters. Now, the characterization, as I've already said, is quite bare bones. The majority of it is for Sam and a little bit for Kane, but past that, there isn't really that much in here. And there are a number of characters that are introduced just almost like plot points. They're there to enable the plot to move forward rather than being characters in their own right, which does them a bit of a disservice. There's 3 main ones for this. The first one is Ez, who acts as the red shirt in this story as he's introduced, goes into a field and dies pretty much instantly as soon as he's introduced. And that kind of lacks any real impact, whereas if it was a Delio, for example, that would have been more of a gut punch right early on and would have probably been a better call, to be honest. You then have Duck, who generates powers right near the beginning of this, and it's unclear what they are, and he kind of has some characterization to him, but not a great deal. He just wants to be left alone and lie in a pool. That's all he wants. And he's really only there because they needed his powers for the fight at the end against the Genophage. And the final one is Hunter, who in self-defense manifested his powers and accidentally killed someone. And their character is largely there, at least in this book, just to allow them to generate the anti-powers feeling within the community. And that's quite true of a few of the other characters in here. They're literally just there to enable the plot to move forward. With that being said, this is the longest Fayz book, I believe, as I've already mentioned, and the world building in here is really good. It does take a very stark look at how things can fall apart and how quickly, especially when everything's just heaped on one person. So that's really good. The sort of cultural analysis of what's going on in Perdido Beach in particular is really, really interesting. It's also a lot more clear in terms of the story it's trying to tell, largely because it's not got all the setup that Gone had to do as well. The other thing I will say is the final third of this book is really, really strong, especially compared to the first 2/3. It's quite set-piecey, but not in a bad way. But like I say, the biggest thing with this is the character work is still not great. So, with all that being said, I still think this is a decent read. For me, it's also better than the previous one. It goes in low-end B tier, in my point of view. I am still going to look at the next one, which I believe is called Lies. That'll be in a couple of months' time. But I'm interested to know your thoughts on this. Have you read this? What did you think about it? Let me know in the comments below. I will catch you all next time.